Russia has waged war against Ukraine for over 36 months, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Rupke with BILD Situation Room, and we start in the western Russian region of Kursk. There, the fighting is increasingly concentrating on the outskirts of Malaya Lokhnya, one of two small towns still under Ukrainian control. We're looking at footage here. One shows an attack by the Russian army on Nikolsky, a suburb directly west of Malaya Lokhnya. And here we see once again how Russian tanks and armored vehicles are advancing towards Nikolsky, attempting to push forward just roughly 2 kilometers to the west of Malaya Lokhnya, moving in formation to advance. But we also see how the Ukrainians are managing to halt all the deployed vehicles of the Russian army right here. That, of course, as often is the case, doesn't mean that all the soldiers were stopped here, that they were killed or wounded, but it could be that the Russians, even if they lose all the vehicles, managed to push forward and occupy new clearings. For example, we have very recent maps which we'll take a look at right now. On them, you can see that the Ukrainians control less and less land here. They're not firmly holding blue on our map, but are instead retreating further and further towards Malaya Lokhnya itself. We nevertheless see here yet again what one might call a vehicle graveyard of the Russian army. I think it's quite clear here that all these vehicles that were deployed, we have one last photo here at the end, were shot to pieces by the Ukrainians. Up here, quite clearly, a main battle tank. This one here is hard to identify. Down here, an MTLB. Here, a third vehicle, a fourth vehicle, in other words, once again. A vehicle graveyard indeed, left behind by the Russians, which this attack here has also left behind right here in Malaya Lokhnya. Nonetheless, we now also have some new footage from yet another small suburb of this town, specifically from Novaya Sorochnaya. And here we now see the Russian tricolor. This means that directly north of Malaya Lokhnya, the Russians have advanced, coming within about 2 kilometers of the village, and have taken one of the last suburbs. Very small suburbs, each with about 20 to 30 houses, were seized by Malaya Lokhnya. When we examine the map, we can observe, especially when recalling the past few days, increasingly significant shifts in favor of the Russian army. We have also heard a kind of distress call, if you will, from the Ukrainians in the last few hours, saying we urgently need more kamikaze drones. Currently, the situation here in Kursk is so critical that we are on the verge of losing large parts of the area. What we just saw, the footage from Nikolsky right here on the ground west of Malaya Lokhnya, and the second one from the more distant location here, positioned between Pokrovsk and Malaya Lokhnya, roughly halfway up the slope. And we can observe that the Russians are attempting to push forward or advance toward this location from both the northern and western directions, steadily advancing their positions. And we know Malaya Lokhnya is especially known for its big prison. One of Kursk's largest prisons is here. And this prison is very solid, with its massive fortress walls. This allows Ukrainians to fortify effectively and, at least for now, maintain their position. To defend this location, if it falls, the Russian advance towards Sudzha from the north would likely, yes, at least directly imminent, would take place directly, and the Russians would not only, as they have so far, advance from the east and west, partially successfully, advance on Sudzha partially, but they'd have this northern route along the railroad and larger roads, which they'd use to reach this last small town, once home to 6,000 residents, and reclaim it from the Ukrainians. What the Russians are managing to achieve in Kursk, they haven't been able to accomplish so far around Pokrovsk, the former 65,000 inhabitant city in the Donetsk region of Ukraine. We have new footage showing that the Ukrainians are very successfully defending Pokrovsk. Once again, it's kamikaze drones targeting Russian troops, some advancing, but others also stuck in place, being shot at. We can see here at the beginning, these are likely military vehicles. Soon we'll see the more precise attacks though. Or here you can already see it, these are partly actual Ladas and partly just civilian vehicles that the Russians are using here. Since they no longer have tanks and armored vehicles to advance in this area, we can clearly see, though we must pixelate these two vehicles, many Russian casualties there. Even though these two vehicles didn't make it into this town, some of the shells still landed in the town itself. This means that this small town we just saw, where further Ukrainian attacks are now taking place, is already under Russian control. Nonetheless, the larger town of Pokrovsk and also the suburb of Mirnorad, which used to have 43,000 inhabitants, both remain firmly under Ukrainian control. And there are even further signs indicating that the Ukrainians are not just holding the area around Pokrovsk, but that they have now successfully retaken a fourth location. This information is brand new, just coming in this morning. We'd like to show you some recent footage from the Ukrainian army, where they are successfully pushing the Russian forces back near Udakne. This is a situation we've seen many times over the past few months. This professionally built facility, we can observe it all. These trench systems are specifically designed to lead toward the operational area, strategically reinforced. East, built by the Ukrainians who were overrun here just a few months ago when there wasn't as much attention on Pokrovsk yet, and the whole situation wasn't quite. Yes, at least it hadn't developed so clearly in favor of Ukraine back then. These facilities were overrun by the Russian army, and we're about to see how the Ukrainians are trying to reclaim their own facilities once again. Let's take another look at it. Here are some recordings that show us that the bombing happens first, and then, as we can see, the Ukrainian soldiers are directly attacking. They're now targeting the Russians, who are most likely hiding in these bunker facilities, originally built by the Ukrainians, and these are being attacked. Now we'll see a cut and another explosion in the bunker facilities, and then we'll witness how the Russians are actually retreating, how they're running away over the railroad tracks in the area, and how they're withdrawing from the region around Udakne. At least after this one battle, they're pulling back. And the whole thing, now we're seeing the facility again after the recapture. We can also see it increasingly better on the maps of the past weeks. Just recently, as mentioned this morning, the Ukrainian army announced, and this has been verified through footage, that Uspenivka, another small village, was recaptured here. It's situated approximately here, though it hasn't been added to our map from today yet. Nevertheless, we just saw the Ukrainian counterattack that was here near Udakne, and we now know that Uspenivka is back under Ukrainian control. And Uspenivka would then already be the fourth location alongside Kotlin, alongside Peshane, and alongside Lysivka, which is not marked here. But the village is located there, the one that would soon be recaptured by the Ukrainians around Pokrovsk. And all of this shows that the Russians are stuck their main objective, namely the city of Pokrovsk, which is their primary target in the region. They're unable to reach it and are instead stuck in front of it. And we just saw it due to the severe lack of vehicles, as most were destroyed by Ukrainians, and the Russians, as we've reported recently, partly using off-road vehicles, civilian ones, partly quads, motorcycles, or even donkeys and horses to advance here. This ultimately means that the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk, at least for the moment, has been halted. A bit further south, the situation is different. There, after heavy fighting, the Russians managed to bring the small town of Andriivka under their control. Here we see the Russian drone footage. Everything is quite snow-covered. Nevertheless, these are the roads of Andriivka, roughly. I can try to trace them again, about 5 or 6 parallel ones, which typically run along the rivers in this region from east to west. And we can now see here how the Russians have successfully managed to raise their flag in an increasing number of locations throughout the city. They do this for propaganda purposes. Here, the Russians scale the building and raise the 140th hammer and sickle flag of the separate brigade of the Russian army. And they do all this, of course, with the purpose of showing we're really everywhere. But we're not just confined to one part of the city, we're not hiding away somewhere, but we've successfully managed to advance into the farthest western areas of the city as well. This here, by the way, is the center which I personally visited back in September. Right about here is where we parked our car, as this was the Nova Pochta, the post office located directly in the center of Andriivka. And a lot of life, including military life, of course, revolved around this area at the time. Here as well, we now see the Russian flag which has been raised on various houses. So the Russians are evidently very proud of what they claim, at least. It also looks as if a large part of Andriivka, if not all of it, is now under their control. We're also taking a look at this on the map. Here we still have the situation where, at least according to the map provider we're using, Deep State Map, it shows fighting around the village. Nevertheless, what we just saw included, on one hand, footage that was captured from the center of Andriivka. From here, as mentioned, there was the post office, but also from the far west of the village, which is why I believe that Deep State Map will likely recolor the entire area differently in the coming days at the latest, so the whole area will then be shaded dark red. Andriivka, one of the places where the Russians have actually advanced further, unlike Toretsk, where, for example, as we'll take a look at right away, where the Ukrainians have returned and the city is now contested again. In Andriivka, it looks like after losing the other places we had here, the largest city here is no longer marked. Nonetheless, Kurakove, once home to 18,000 residents, along with smaller villages like Dakne and Ulagli, fell one after the other, and the movement of the front line in this region is solely westward, heading towards central Ukraine, albeit at an extremely slow pace. Just for this, well, what you see up there, that's approximately 10 kilometers from Kurakove to Andriivka. The Russian army has now successfully taken complete control over Andriivka. It took them about 3 months. So, nonetheless, the situation in Andriivka remains complicated. and the Russians seem to have now gained full control over the entire area. From Andriivka, we'll make our way to Toretsk, starting by looking at the map this time. What we're about to look at are recordings from the outskirts of Toretsk, where the Russian army is attempting to push further, and this is being prevented in a very particular and, one must say, extremely brutal manner. Toretsk, clearly visible once more. The dark grey outlines the city limits. We can see that within the city, the Russians hold a portion, a bit more than half, I'd say. However, we can clearly observe these large orange areas, partly extending into the city center, where intense fighting is still ongoing. That means the Ukrainians are continuing their efforts to combat the Russians within the city itself. And we're now seeing footage from outside the city, from the city limits, where the Russians are, of course, also trying to advance further westward. For example, here in the direction of the next town, for instance, also here in the direction of the field, simply to continue this flanking movement, to not remain where you are, because then you become a suitable target for drones. But to keep advancing. Now we'll see how the Ukrainians counter this. And the entire footage is undeniably quite shocking and intense, as one must acknowledge, making it truly impactful to observe. So we see here a piece of forest on the edge of Toretsk, and the Ukrainians, anticipating the Russian advance, have heavily invested in barbed wire here. That means we see all these barbed wires here just stretching and moving along like this. And behind that right here, we can see it. That's the Ukrainian position. That's the bunker. And it's very similar to how it was in the First and Second World Wars, right? You stay behind, you wait, watching the enemy run into the barbed wire. And once they've done that, then you shoot them directly. Down here, we see a Russian soldier, and at this moment, yes, we don't know for sure if he's wounded or not, but he's definitely still moving. He's apparently gotten caught in the barbed wire, trying to keep moving, and now we also see up there how the Ukrainian soldiers are taking in the whole situation. They probably got some intel from a drone, and now they're immediately targeting the Russian, which of course we have to pixelate. Firing, we now see the Ukrainian shooting again to the left. And now he shoots towards the lower left, hitting the Russian, who is still caught in the barbed wire, and ultimately killing him. And the whole thing is indeed a simple, brutal, yet in this case also an effective tactic for the Ukrainian army to continuously disrupt and slow down the ongoing Russian advance around the Toretsk region. From Donetsk, we move on to Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine. Here we have fresh footage revealing that the Russian army still clearly maintains access to modern battle tanks, even if not in the same numbers as, for example, last year, or certainly not as many as in 2022. And here we see a modern Russian tank of the T-80B-VM type being attacked by the Ukrainian army. Once more, it's a drone that hits with remarkable precision, striking the exact center of the tank, right in front of the turret section. Hits the turret and precisely the hatch there, and now we see flames bursting out from the hatch almost instantly right after the initial impact occurs. We can see this very clearly. The second drone flies straight in again, highly precise, knowing exactly, guided by the fire, where it needs to go. And that is the massive explosion. Of the fuel, of course, but also presumably of the ammunition that is taking place here after the second drone has hit this T-80B VM. We still see the barrel of the tank here, and otherwise the whole thing is engulfed in flames. That means Russia still has a limited number of tanks they're actively deploying at the front. Far, far fewer than just a few months ago, but even these, if they are spotted or noticed by the Ukrainian forces, even these will continue to be gradually diminished over time. And not only Russian tanks remain in the crosshairs, threatened by Ukrainian kamikaze drones and falling victim to them, but also high-tech air defense systems like this Buk M3 system, which we see here. A relatively modern system, produced for only a few years now, and with a price tag of around 50 million euros each. We see the drones approach, and we can now also clearly recognize during the approach that it's one of these Buk M3 systems, because we see on one side, here, the missile launcher, which in this case is not yet extended but is lying on top here. And here in the front we see the particularly expensive radar system, which is now being targeted by the Ukrainian kamikaze drone. As mentioned, this is taking place roughly 20 kilometers behind the front. Now here's the direct approach, because these systems are so valuable and, in terms of range, designed in such a way that they aren't moved any closer to the front. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have by now found ways to overcome this distance with their drones and thus achieve a greater range than the most modern Russian air defense systems in Ukraine. Another advanced system of the Russian army has become a casualty in Ukraine, specifically a self-propelled howitzer or gun carriage, if you will, of the type 2S-43 Malva, and this highly advanced 152mm artillery system was carefully concealed in a forested area here. We see that first a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone has spotted it, The whole thing has been slightly edited here, and we see the Russians have made significant efforts to conceal it, as we can quite clearly observe that these large nets have been draped over it, which are now covered in snow. Nevertheless, hidden beneath is this very modern self-propelled artillery piece, which the Ukrainians are about to attack with multiple rounds of ammunition. Down here, we can also take another detailed look at the Malva system itself. First, we observe a precise shot aimed directly at the system, followed by another shot shortly after that. Because the crew is naturally moving away here using cluster munition, allegedly fired from a HIMARS gun as well, which the Ukrainians decided to use here. With multiple targets, we just spotted a support vehicle that was hit, and here's the Malva once more, now with before and after shots, if you will. So the Ukrainians also want to demonstrate that they successfully targeted this costly 152mm self-propelled artillery system. Finally, we'll take a closer look at an attack carried out using a French precision bomb, or potentially even two of them, which were precisely aimed at a water tower or a structure of that very same particular kind, which had been occupied by the Russians. We are here in the south of Ukraine, in the Zaporizhia region, and we can see that the Russians have set up a lot of equipment here. That means a lot of jammers, electronic warfare systems, surveillance, and so on were installed in this tower because of its height. To extend the range beyond the horizon, they were installed here, and the Ukrainians are currently attempting to target and collapse this tower by launching two AASSM-250 bombs manufactured in France directly at its structure. We see two explosions right at the tower, but, and this is also part of the truth, these bombs, while very precise, are also very light compared to the Russian bombs. Here we practically see two holes in the tower, one on the side from the first explosion, and if we continue now, here we see the second explosion on the second side. That means two direct hits here. We see a very large hole in comparison. Nevertheless, the tower does not collapse. However, we can assume that the Russian technology, which had to be wired from the systems up top down to the command posts located further below, at least that technology was destroyed. In any case, the Ukrainians continue to rely on Western, not just American, but also French precision weapons, to also continue attacking Russian targets in the occupied south and east of the country with their air force.